Oh yeah, you know, Doug Pagitt Radio, religious talk that isn't quite right.
Welcome back to Pagitt Radio. We're going to have a conversation here with Candi Dugas. She is the author of a book, "Who Told You That You Were Naked?" And thrilled to have Candi on. I've gotten her her own little theme song called "Candy's Room" from Bruce Springsteen. So,
Candy's Room.
yeah, do you know that song, "Candy's Room"?
I don't think so.
So thrilled to have Candi on the program.
Good morning. This is Candi.
Hey, Candi, this is Doug Pagitt in Victoria.
Hi, Candy.
Hello. Hello.
How are you?
I am well. How are y'all?
Oh, we're great. Hey, thanks so much for being on the show, and sorry for the confusion the other day about us changing from Wednesdays to Thursdays.
Oh, that's okay.
That was
no
all.
problem.
That was all my doing. Candi, we're really excited about this conversation. Had a chance to look at your book called "Who Told You That You Were Naked?" Congratulations on it, and
Thank you very much.
And it's also it was a part of your doctoral thesis. Is that right? So it's part of what has made you a doctor.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Candi, tell us what you were getting at with "Who Told You That You Were Naked?" That's obviously a phrase that comes out of the book of Genesis, and you're wanting to raise a question about women, but you frame it through the lens of black women and the pursuing of justice and freedom in sexuality as opposed to the kinds of restrictions and so on.
Yes. Well, sex is a good thing, and the church ought to affirm it as such. And so when I was working on my practicum, which is sort of a prelude to the thesis, I was working with a group of people, mixed gender group of people, about the vitality and the relevance of the church today. Out of that conversation came a concern from them, and primarily from the women who happened to be black women, saying that, all of this is really wonderful, but if I could scream to the leaders of the church, I would say the church fails me in giving me practical, daily advice or guidance in matters of my personal relationships, in my dating relationships. And so that's how we ended up with this thesis.
Now, I will tell you, I mean, I'm a pastor and I do this little religious radio show, even though it's not quite right. And I felt this like when I looked not only at the book, but then at Sex in Spirituality website of yours, I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe this is far more risque than I thought it was. And so what is it about someone like me even and other religious people for whom there's this like worry that if someone says, look, sex is a good thing and churches should be better at helping people have more healthy and better and more spiritual kinds of sex, what is it that makes someone like me, get uncomfortable? Why do I feel uncomfortable? Like, oh my gosh, how are we going to talk about this?
Well,
like,
there's
what's
a
wrong
certain
with me?
vulnerability
Yeah.
that comes along when we talk about matters of intimacy. I did get a chance to listen to the beginning of the show this morning, and y'all were talking about the masks and the faces that get worn. When we show our true selves, wherever we are, we are exposed, and we are generally uncomfortable with that. There are a lot of different ways you can go into looking at what are the sources of that. But if we're looking at religion, or more so than spirituality, religion, at least in this country, and as far as Christianity is concerned, has taught us to cover. And that cover comes off a little more and more as generations go along.
Interesting.
But I think that the vestiges of that original teaching from the Puritans, whatever, still exists. And then there's the other very real part of the fact that sex and sexuality is the source of a lot of abuse and misuse and pain for folks. And so we sort of tend to say, well, let's get rid of the source of that. Rather than really dealing with how it's been misused or abused. And I think that contributes to our level of discomfort.
So, I like that idea a lot. And is that part of the reason that you picked the title, "Who Told You That You Were Naked"? Because hearing you talk about, like, well, there's these masks or this covering, And when we take off that covering, that started to play in my mind. Is that where this notion, either in some of the ancient narratives, that end up in Genesis, or the ones that you refer to in the book, that when someone is naked, we think about that as an overly vulnerable kind of position, but that true spirituality, I'm not suggesting you're a nudist, I don't know, maybe you are, but that true spirituality should not need that kind of those kinds of coverings, that kind of self-protection, and that nakedness is the place that healthy spirituality should take us, whether it's emotional nakedness or relational nakedness, vulnerability, or physical nakedness.
I don't know if I would call it true, but I would say that it is more authentic. It's more authentic, and there's a greater sense of intimacy the more naked you are. And I think that really is the message in the Genesis texts when Eve and Adam, or the first humans in the narrative, partake of something that they believed they weren't supposed to partake of, which led to feeling ashamed because of what they thought about that whole thing. And then God saying, well, where are you? God reaching out saying, let's talk about this. And they instead ran to cover themselves, to try and sort of like what I did when I was a little girl. When if I did something wrong, I'd run under the dining room table trying to hide because I felt ashamed of whatever it is that I did. And I think that really is the message of Genesis, of God saying, yeah, I know you did that, but I'm inviting you in your nakedness to talk to me about it, and let's move further in our relationship.
So those ancient texts, right? And it's such a rich story. And you've, as I'm sure you've done, a lot of us have wondered, why were those stories preserved and then put into the Jewish narratives, and why have they been powerful? And there does seem to be something about that narrative, right? If you take Adam and Eve, and people want to interpret that in varieties of ways, and I think that's fine. But this kind of notion that Adam and Eve in that storyline are created naked, right, in the story, and then they realize that they're naked. So that eating of the forbidden didn't make them naked; it caused them to realize their situation. And people will often say, you're born into the world naked, and you're going to go out of the world naked. Then in between, you're sort of encultured to live in shame. And is that some of what of what you've noticed in the work that you do, and in the book that you've written, is that we do have to find a different kind of spirituality that doesn't oppress this more natural way?
Yes, it's about a journey between the two naked realities of our being. And so you asked in the previous question about where did the title come from. And so in my conversation with Dr. Willie Godman, who is a pastoral care counselor and professor at the Interdenominational Theological Center here in Atlanta, that is one of his core tenets when he works with groups. He asks, who told you that you were naked? So he sort of took the scripture and turned it into this way of approaching this subject with people. And so his premise is that you're born with this wonderful freedom and liberation as a person. And somewhere along the way, probably as a toddler, when you begin to walk and you run away from your parents without the diaper, and they're like, no, you must be covered.
Yeah.
That's when you start to get, oh, I did something wrong. I thought I was just being free. And because they are not comfortable with your nakedness, they were not comfortable with their nakedness. And it sort of gets passed down. So the challenge is for us as individuals in between our naked states to find a comfort level and to own our nakedness in this journey.
So when you talk about this as a religious person and as a spiritual person, how do audiences, or more importantly, the people who invite you to speak to these things, how does that go? Because it feels like, even though we live in a world with really changing sexual and body type mores, boy, it seems like within religious communities to have someone come to church or go to a conference and talk about these things in those religious environments, there is still this kind of either Catholic or puritanical understanding of separating sexuality from spirituality. Do you freak people out? Are people like, we can't have Candi in because she just makes people so uncomfortable? Or do you find in black churches or in other cultural churches a openness and receptivity to these ideas?
The conversations so far have been more individual. They have not expanded to a larger group yet. And I believe that is because of the discomfort with something that runs so against the grain of what we're used to of saying or advocating, when we of advocating that this is an acceptable way of thinking about yourself and God, and that it will not cause you to lose your salvation. So, but one-on-one, women are talking to me about this and saying it's so needed. And so really, when I'm saying that the Black woman has a cry that needs to be answered, at this point, it probably is not going to come from an official religious body like a church. The women, which they already do, as girlfriends do, they gather around the table or at the restaurant or whatever, and they talk about things that matter to them. They are the ones who have to take these theological tools and reconfigure for themselves their faith and what works for them.
So on your sexinspirit.wordpress site, I found it interesting that you make this this, I don't know if it's a comment or a noticing that in Christian spirituality, it has often been built around the Greek language and Greek notions and concepts, and that there's three kinds of love words in the Greek. There's the agape love, which is the unconditional love, and people often talk about that as God's love. And then there's the phileo love, that's brotherly, sisterly, familial kind of love. And then there's this erotic or this eros love. And I think you say there that basically the church has been really committed to two types of those, but not really committed to the third type. And in fact, even saying that God's love is really the unconditional type, that sort of elevates that type of love. And it feels like you're wanting to say, no, look, if those three words are actually identifying or grasping something significant, that there is an accepting love and a familial love, but also an erotic love, that if God is love, God is all of those things. And we can't sort of keep God in the one kind of love box.
That's correct.
But now I feel uncomfortable saying love box, because now I'm like, oh my gosh, see, this is where it goes right here. Now I'm embarrassed erotic, right? And smirking, yeah.
And so, but see, it starts when you are a subscriber to the Christian faith. Then you are subscribing to a faith that rests on its incarnational quality, that it rests on a body, that the divine came to live in a body, and that body's life and death as a sacrifice, and then resurrection, that the body resurrected is the key, is the fulcrum of what we believe. Yeah. But yet westernized Christianity, as you were mentioning, the Greek influence is Platonized, that and Plato lifted up a belief that is dual. It separates the spirit soul from the body and then makes it hierarchical, saying that the spirit soul is higher than the body. And so then that leads to that separation you were talking about all different kinds of love. And then the misuse and abuse that we were talking about, because erotica is different than pornography. But we tend to, just lump it all together. And with all of the abuses that are inherent in pornography, then we just sort of stay away from erotica. We stay away from sex unless it's within this certain parameter that we may construct and say it's okay here, but it's not okay here. And that sort of just constricts and further limits and limits and limits at every level who we are as people.
All right, Candi, I want you, hold on, Victoria. I'm just going to do a little pause on the video recording that we have, because we do these in little segments. So I want to come back and talk about that topic. You want to follow up on that too?